Since the end of World War II, houses in the US have been getting continuously bigger, even as the number of people living in them has gone down. In 1950, the average new house built was about 1,000 square feet, with about 300 square feet of living space per person. By 2015, 2,700 square feet, with over 1,000 square feet of living space per person. That's more than 3 times as large. At the same time, in the last 10 years, these have become popular. Tiny houses, generally defined as a dwelling of about 400 square feet or less. So after decades of houses getting bigger, how is it that these have become something that people want? The answer is important because a house like this uses a lot of resources to build, to maintain, to heat, to cool. And we're living at a time when the way we're using our resources is on track to cause environmental catastrophe. So what if we could understand what it is that makes people want tiny houses instead? What if we could understand how it is that they've succeeded in making people want less? A few years ago, I was spending my work breaks reading tiny house blogs. Yes, and at night, I was reading a monster 19th century German novel about the ideal life in a country manor house, huge house. And after a few weeks of this, reading the blogs in the daytime and this novel at night, I realized that in many ways I was reading the same story in both places. And this has led to my idea that part of the reason tiny houses have become popular is because they've tapped into a central story of Western culture, a story about what it means to be a fulfilled individual. And they've changed it in a way that has made people want less instead of more. So what is that story? Well, it's the coming-of-age novel, or as we say in German, and also in American literary studies, the Bildungsroman. It first emerged in Germany around 1800, but it's appeared in many forms in the centuries since, some of which you certainly know. Books like Jane Austen, or Great Expectations, The Outsiders, even Harry Potter. The storyline goes something like this. At the beginning, the protagonist feels stifled by social expectations. He breaks free on a journey of self-discovery and exploration. But in the end, returns home or to another stable place in society. It's a story about autonomy and self-actualization and finding a place for yourself in the world. In many ways, it's really a story about asking for more than society expects from you. And I would say this is what many tiny house stories are about, too. To illustrate this, I'm going to show you a blog written by a woman named Jess Sullivan. Between 2012 and 2017, Sullivan and her partner Dan planned, built by themselves, lived in, and then eventually sold a tiny house. The way Sullivan tells her story, it goes something like this. Her first marriage collapsed under the weight of social expectations. In particular, the expectations associated with buying and then renovating a big house. When she and Dan got together, they decided they wanted to do something different. They wanted to go tiny. Doing this gave them the financial freedom for Sullivan to quit her job and pursue her passions, painting, photography, writing, and baking. She eventually started her own baking business. At the same time, it helped them find a human community that they could relate to, the tiny house movement, where they both became active members, and Sullivan herself became a spokesperson of sorts. So we see in this story the same stages as in the coming-of-age novel: dissatisfaction with society, breaking free to exploration, finding a place to belong. What makes tiny house stories different, or one of the things that makes them different, is context. The traditional coming-of-age novel comes from a place of material security. In fact, the early novels were criticized for this because they tended to be about upper-class white men with the social and the financial freedom to explore themselves. The natural world, when it appears in these stories, is a backdrop. It's not something you have to worry about, it's just a given. Tiny houses, on the other hand, and tiny house stories come from a place of material insecurity. They first started to become popular during the last recession, when a lot of people felt their financial footing was insecure. And they're popular among millennials, who some would say are the most financially insecure generation in the US for a long time. They're also a response to the sense that we can't take the natural world for granted anymore. That in fact, our actions are destroying the very foundations of our lives and of the life around us. So tiny house stories have slightly different goals. First, they're to save money, often. Second, they're to save the planet by living sustainably. And third, they're to live simply in order to do both. They're really about finding fulfillment despite and within these material constraints. So for Sullivan and Dan, choosing less gave them the financial freedom for her to explore her passions. Choosing less also allowed them to feel part of something bigger, the tiny house movement, but also the natural world. And I'll be very concrete here. They chose to go without indoor plumbing, no running water, composting toilet, and to preserve water and feel part of the natural nutrient cycle. So while the traditional coming-of-age novel is about finding your place in human society, the tiny house story is about that too, but it's also about finding a sustainable place to belong in the material world. In my first job out of college, I had a colleague who had a bumper sticker on her car. "Need less," it said in big black letters. And that bumper sticker has stuck with me for decades. But the problem with need less is that it sounds like sacrifice. It sounds like having to do without. Want less, the mantra of the tiny house, feels very different. It can still be about pursuing your dreams. It can still be about asking for more than society expects for you. In the words of tiny house dwellers and enthusiasts, own less, live more, or less house, more life. Or in Sullivan's words, I desperately wanted more from my life, more from myself. I'm not here to argue for tiny houses today because they have their own problems. First, if you really want to live sustainably, a tiny house is not your best option. Apartment living is far more efficient than a standalone tiny house. Second, tiny houses have their own issues with privilege. A tiny house is a tiny house and not a trailer, in part because it's beautiful, but in part because it's seen as a choice. Because the people who live in tiny houses have the financial and/or the social capital to perceive that they have a choice about the way they want to live. But what interests me about tiny houses is the idea. The idea that we might respond to our environmental predicament, at least in part, not by changing who we are or what it means to be human, but just by adapting the stories that we're already telling ourselves about the world. What else could we learn to want? Thank you.